And this is a very, very important topic, very deep topic. And what I tried to say last time is a basic idea. The Yisuin of Mashiach is really not different from the Yisuin of Tzaddikim, of really righteous people, except that the Yisuin of Mashiach is the greatest example of this thing. Now we laid down last time a very fundamental principle, and it's something that you really have to realize. People suffer in this world for several reasons, but suffering comes in this world because of either justice, because the person is being punished, or the suffering is coming to atone for certain things that the person did. Now there are people in the world who suffer not because of anything that they did. And this kind of suffering is called Yisuin Shel Ahava, or Yisuin of love. Yisuin Shel Ahava, and it's a very important category of suffering, and it's called Yisuin Shel Ahava because the Baruch Hashem gives it essentially out of his love for Klal Yisrael, and what it's designed to do, although it's a very mysterious suffering, because why should a person suffer for no reason at all? And I explained last week some of the important reasons for that, and the reason for it, as I said, is this very important principle, that the Baruch Hashem created the world with respect to two objectives. One is called justice, and the other is called mercy. And the truth of the matter is, both are contradictory. So that once the Baruch Hashem says that my world is based on justice, mercy really has no place in that system. In order for the Baruch Hashem then to therefore use the principle of mercy so that the world does not suffer the consequences of absolute justice, the Baruch Hashem then has to employ certain types of mechanisms. Now, what the nature of the mechanism is, we will not go into, just like we did not go into last time, and is the subject of an advanced share. But the basic idea is that the Baruch Hashem needs to take certain individuals or certain types of forces and in a certain way occupy the judicial forces with these different entities. And by doing that, the Baruch Hashem is then, so to speak, able to slip in and be merciful. That's the essential concept. And it's a concept we mentioned last week. It's the notion of a decoy, of something to distract you from the main objective. And the Baruch Hashem has to provide a decoy or distract the Satan, who is the judicial angel, the prosecutory angel. And by distracting, he does this by allowing that malach, or that angel, to begin to focus on certain key individuals in the world. And as that malach focuses on those individuals, what happens is that he is not then preoccupied with the Jews in terms of accusing the Jews. And then the Baruch Hashem therefore is able to do certain things, employ certain aspects of mercy on the Jews. These individuals who the Baruch Hashem chooses as a decoy are few and far in between. Believe me. You see, they're very special people, and the rule that we understand is there are certain critical rules that apply to these people. First of all, the Baruch Hashem does not choose an individual who himself would not have wanted it. You see, the Baruch Hashem just doesn't go over an individual who's a very great tzaddik and say, I'm going to use you and give you suffering so that we can redeem the Jews. The Baruch Hashem will not do that unless he knows that this tzaddik would have accepted that particular role. That's number one. The second thing, which is very important, and I'm going to tell you a very, very important deep principle, is that even when the Baruch Hashem approaches that tzaddik, he just doesn't suddenly come down on that tzaddik and give him a lot of problems. He doesn't do that. What happens is, no suffering can come on a person unless that person in some way deserves it. But I just said that the suffering that comes on a person, Yisuin Shel Ahava, is because he doesn't deserve it. So which way is it? The answer is that no suffering can come on a person unless in some way the person deserves it through justice. But the question is, how much suffering will he get by virtue of a deed that he did? And this is a very important concept. And let me give you some important examples. When the Baruch Hashem, for example, chooses a tzaddik and says, I'm going to bring suffering on this tzaddik, Yisuin Shel Ahava, so that I can preoccupy the Satan, I can preoccupy the prosecutory angel with that individual, and therefore I can extend mercy to the rest of the Jews. You see, when he does that and he chooses a tzaddik, he has to wait till that tzaddik does something wrong. He may do a very small minor sin, and suddenly a sledgehammer comes down on him. But the tzaddik has to open up the possibility of getting suffering through some minor sin. Classic example, there's a number of classic examples, but there's one very classic example which is told with Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, and Ramchal, Rabbi Lutzaro says himself this example. Rabbi Yehuda Nossi was, of course, just like the greatest man in Israel at the time. He's the one who wrote the Mishnah, and he was the president. He was the president of the Jews, a descendant from David, Yehuda the prince. And one day, what happened was, he was walking in the street apparently, and a cow, or some kind of a cow, was running through the street. And it ran up to him and spoke to him in its language, and Rabbi Yehuda understood it. And the cow said to him, "Save me, because the sheikhet, the slaughterer, is running after me, and he wants to slaughter me." And he said, "Please save me from the slaughterer." So Rabbi Yehuda said to it, "I cannot save you, lekach notzota, because you were created for that purpose." You see, that's what he said. So apparently they caught the cow and they killed the cow. So the fact is, Rabbi Yehuda said to the cow what basically was true. He says, "Look, he obviously saw in the nefesh of this cow, and the truth is that this is the purpose of its creation. I mean, you can't take it away." But somehow there was something that he did, maybe the way he said it, someone just a disregard, that he exhibited what's called axorius, or a certain taint of cruelty. And suddenly he began to experience a toothache for the next 7 years. An intense toothache for the next 7 years. Finally, after 7 years, there was a kitten that was drinking milk or something like that, and somebody wanted to take away the milk, and then Rabbi Yehuda said, "Don't take away the milk, let the kitten drink." And then the pain went away. You see. So the interesting thing is, we see instinct that he had this immense pain for simply really revealing the truth, you see. But what we see here, this is a perfect example of Yisur Shel Ava. The Rebbe was looking to give Rabbi Yehuda a certain amount of suffering because he needed certain atonements or sacrifices to enable him to be merciful to the Jews. But he had to wait till Rabbi Yehuda did something which was a little wrong. It was a small little thing, wasn't it? But somehow, according to what his level was, he exhibited a slightly higher taint of cruelty. And suddenly, the amount of suffering that he had nothing to do with what he did. But all the Rebbe needed was a Pesach, which means that the Satan cannot come down to make you suffer unless in some way you've given him a justification through justice. You see. Except that these tzaddikim, when he does finally come down and give them suffering, it's far out of proportion for what they should get. And then when the time comes for it to go away, it leaves based on another good deed. But that's a classic example of Yisur Shel Ava given in that way. There's another very classic example that was given by Avram. The Rebbe said to Avram, by the Bris Ben Avram, he said, "I promise you that your children will inherit the land of Israel." So Avram said to him, "B'mo'eda, how do I know this? How do I know that such a thing is true? How can you guarantee me such a thing?" So then the Rebbe said, "I will put your children into the land of Egypt for 400 years. That's what he said. So the Talmud says, why did he punish the Jews? So it says one of the reasons why the Jews were punished was because of the fact that Avram, because he said, "How do I know?" he showed a certain level of skepticism when it came to what the Banishim said. So as a punishment for that, his children would have to go down to Egypt for 400 years. Now clearly, one really has nothing to do with the other. But again, you have the same basic kind of principle. That when the Banishim needs a certain amount of suffering, in order to what? A certain amount of suffering from a specific individual or individuals, in order to allow him to redeem the masses, the world, he has to wait for some slight transgression, and then he acts. Now the question is, if this tzaddik suffers, what is he going to get from all this? I mean, he suffers for so much, for all these other people. The answer is, then he gets the reward of having saved the entire world. So it's not that he doesn't get anything for it, you see. It's just a suffering that does not come to him because of something he's done. That's called Yisur Shel Ava. Now the highest example of Yisur Shel Ava, of course, is the two Mashiach and Moshe Rabbeinu, what's called Moshe Mashiachim. And they are so high, their category is so great, that it's called, as I said last week, the Soblei Haroyim, or those who are sober, who endure sickness or suffering. They call it Soblei Haroyim, Moshe Rabbeinu and the two Mashiach. The function, therefore, of the Yisur of the Mashiach is specifically so that the Jews will survive. And even though the Jews will survive in a very deplorable state, like now they're in the state of exile, but the fact is, it is the suffering of the Mashiach and the suffering of these tzaddikim which allow the Jews to survive at all. You see, because were it not for these decoys, then the Jews as a nation would not survive their justice. Now we see this constantly. We see this in the Shemona Esrei. We see this many times. It says there in the Shemona Esrei. V'nemar kifoda Hashem et Yaakov, because God redeems Jacob, u'go'oloi miyad chazak mimenu, and He redeems him from that which is stronger than him. It says that the Baruch Hashem saves Yaakov or redeems Yaakov from that which is stronger than him. What does it mean, that which is stronger? What's stronger than Yaakov that God has to come and redeem him? Then it says, Baruch Ato Hashem Go'al Yisrael. It's in Mayav, right before you say Yisrael. You see, blessed be you, O God, who redeems Israel. But it says basically that the Baruch Hashem redeems Jacob from that which is stronger than him. And what does it mean that He redeems Jacob? What's stronger than Jacob? What's stronger than Yaakov that the Baruch Hashem has to go and redeem him? The answer is, the only thing which is stronger than you, and which has the ability, you see, to cause you suffering are your sins. So what it says is that the Baruch Hashem redeems Yaakov from that which is stronger, from the transgressions of Yaakov. You see. In the first blessing in the Shemona Esrei, we say, Baruch Ato Hashem, Mogen Avraham, the shield of Abraham. What is the meaning of the shield of Abraham? What does that mean? The shield of Abraham essentially refers to the blessing that the Baruch Hashem gave to Avraham and says that I guarantee that your children will occupy, will reside someday in Olam Haba and in Eretz Yisrael, and I guarantee you that. That guarantee, even despite the fact that the Jews can transgress, you see, it's called the shield of Abraham. It's a guarantee to Avraham that his children will inherit Olam Haba. That guarantee, of course, is made. But how does the Baruch Hashem fulfill the guarantee? Through the mechanism of Yisur Sharava and the concept of the Sovei Chaloim, especially the sufferings of the Mashiach. So this is the basic idea. That's why the Mashiach suffers. Now the question that we began to go into last time, how does the Mashiach suffer? What does that mean he suffers? Now we know that the suffering of the Mashiach is a highly unbearable suffering. And there are many different aspects to it, and I will not go into all the aspects of the suffering of the Mashiach at this point. The critical aspect that we have to know right now in terms of the suffering of Mashiach has to do with the relationship of the Mashiach to the Orosh of Mashiach, or the Mashiach to his light. We all know what the light of the Mashiach is. We've spent enough time explaining what the light of the Mashiach is. But the fact of the matter is that there is nobody who sees that light clearer than the Mashiach himself. And that light, of course, is the source of enormous simcha and joy. When the Mashiach is taken away from the light, or rather when that light is blocked from coming to the Mashiach, then the Mashiach suffers pain. He suffers pain. And that is one of its critical aspects of suffering. The pain itself. The pain that the Mashiach somehow is separated from his light. Now you may say, if he's separated from his light, or from the light which characterizes his mission, why does he suffer? He doesn't know much about it. The answer is, and this is the problem, is that the neshama of the Mashiach is such that he does see the light, except that it's at a distance, and he cannot touch it. He cannot do anything with it. And that causes an enormous suffering. Now, the Mashiach suffers and cannot come to this light because there is a true disfigurement in his nefesh. The suffering of Mashiach is not physical. He does not suffer physically. In Tehillim it says, what do you call it? Le'evad nimka Yosef. Yosef was sold as a slave. That's what it says. Barzel bo'u nafsho. An iron yoke entered into his soul. That's what it says. And it's talking about Yosef, who is the main Mashiach who suffers. You see, because the main suffering has to do with the concept of Yosef. And I'll just let me get into that in a second. But it says that what does it mean an iron yoke entered his soul? We see from this that it's not physical suffering that he undergoes, it's a spiritual, mental agony. Because it says that an iron yoke enters into his soul. So the suffering of the Mashiach is nefesh. It's a quality of his pnimius. It's the internal mind. and his internal mental tranquility, which is damaged. You see, and that damage which he sustains, that damage does not allow him to see the light. Not only does he see light, it's more than that. It's much deeper than that. The Mashiach cannot reach the level of Vekas or the level of Yerushalayim in which he's capable of reaching. What is that level? The Mashiach obviously has the capacity, even in his lowest level. And we have said, remember, that in the level of the Mashiach of suffering, that is called the Mashiach the Kilkuloi. An important terminology. The Mashiach in the state of Kilkul. Kilkul means damage. The Mashiach the Kilkuloi refers to the Mashiach in this state of suffering. When that suffering leaves, it's called the Mashiach b'tikunoi, or in the state of its correction, tikkun. You see, those are the two critical states of the Mashiach if he comes when Klal Yisrael is not worthy of it. If the Mashiach comes when Klal Yisrael is worthy because they bring him through their mitzvahs, then the Mashiach doesn't experience any kilkul, only tikkun. He experiences kilkul and that suffering only when the Rebbeinu Shalom has to save Klal Yisrael from their own sins. Now, no, get it.
Well, is this sounds like the same kind of suffering that any sensitive person who's aware of having great potential but has, a lot of difficulty reaching it, would have only maybe a different degree. It sounds like that same kind of suffering, only maybe tremendously intensified.
Yes, well, that's a good point. This aspect of the Mashiach suffering that I'm describing, which is in essence the inability of the Mashiach to reach his potential, you see, would seem to be that which is suffered by other people as well. And the truth of the matter is that there are many, many people, in fact, the interesting thing today is what you see is that many people with great talents and great gifts seem to in certain way be impeded or blocked towards achieving those gifts. We seem to have inundated in today's generation with a lot of very gifted people who are somehow very disturbed or very blocked in truly manifesting these gifts. And the truth is, this is no coincidence. Because in some ways, in a shadow, or in a very distant way, many people go through what the Mashiach is going through in their way. Yes. That type of suffering, where a person has enormous potential, powerful potential in different ways, especially potential for Kedusha in some way, and yet there's a tremendous amount of inner turmoil, a lot of turbulence and agitation, you see. And there's agony there, and agony specifically directed to the fact that the person is aware of what he could do and he cannot. That type of suffering, good, is the kind of suffering of the Mashiach. It is. And I would even venture to say that in some ways, you see, it's a slight takeoff of that. That there could be certain aspects, messianic aspects, that in some way are hidden in people. And the truth is, as I said before, every Jew in some way is connected to the light of the Mashiach. Because when the Mashiach arrives, every Jew will participate in that light, according to his level. And because of the fact that every Jew is connected to the light and the ultimate redemption, every Jew in some way is connected, as we said, to the process of Mashiach. Remember, the process of Mashiach is to matahar, or to purify himself, and the process of Mashiach Medavid is to elevate himself. But fundamentally, those processes of Tahara and Kedusha are true of every Jew. And like I said, every Jew, every Neshama will connect in some way to the purpose of the Mashiach. Except that the Mashiach represents the climax of the prophecies. And it represents the prophecies in its highest ultimate form. But every person, in and of his own self, has the functions of the two Mashiachs in him. Of course. Why? Because Adam Rishon was the primordial Mashiach. If Adam Rishon had not sinned, he would have been the Mashiach. You see. And since all of us come from Adam Rishon, all of us have a piece of Mashiach in us. All of us. The ones who become the actual Mashiach in the end are the ones who have a full piece of it on them. And they take on the brunt of the whole thing, and they also redeem the Jews from the entire matter. They represent the climactic aspect of the redemption. But the fact of the matter is that every Jew has a piece of Yosef in him and a piece of David. And that kind of suffering which we're describing is the kind of suffering which is peculiar and unique to the Mashiach. Yes.
The question is, this is like that. You said Abraham, the Jews, because of Abraham's questioning and doubt, the Jews had to be
Yeah, but that's what was Yisur and Shalava. It was not obviously...
Why did the Jews have to be for Abraham? Abraham should have been punished.
Right.
And
I know. That's part of the whole thing. That obviously was totally disproportionate. Something else was going on.
Right. You don't want to go on.
No, and that would be the whole concept of Egypt at a different time.
Okay. How come Joseph was chosen as Mishuk?
I don't know. He had the koyach of Mishuk and Yosef.
What do you mean? I mean, you're talking about Mishuk and Joseph all these weeks. Why was it Joseph? Why
Who else would it be?
Why?
Who? Who else?
Why? Well, it could have been any of the other brothers.
Why was Moshe chosen to do? We don't know the answer to that. Why is specific neshama chosen to have a specific task?
But those are
it's not known.
neshamas. I mean, in terms
but they're not. It's not knowable. It's questionable even if it's knowable. Why is certain neshamas chosen for certain things? And even if it was knowable, it's really totally out of. It has to do with where the neshamas come from. It has to do with very, very deep things. It's totally out of. Advanced.
I think it's amazing, no matter what question we ask, how way out it is, all of a sudden the material says, it's a whole issue that there's a whole big thing about that.
Why isn't it?
I'm
trying to think, what is it?
No, I'm amazed. I didn't think that there was an answer to your question. I thought it was, well, why pick one over the other? And if Reuben would have been picked, then we would be calling him Mashiach so Reuben instead of Mashiach Mashiach ben Reuben. But then you went on. I had to say something that I've never heard about, that each neshama has a certain type of sequence to it, and it depends where it's coming from.
Right.
Did we ever talk about it?
No.
See, I was trying to think, what did Joseph do to have to go through the suffering and to be chosen in terms of
it has to do
brothers and then going into Egypt and...
there's a question that's being asked here, which is somewhat of a deviation, and it's really the question, interesting enough, is that why is, for example, Moshe Rabbeinu chosen to be Moshe Rabbeinu? Like, what did he do that he was such a fortunate person that he chose to be Moshe Rabbeinu? When we say that Moshe Rabbeinu was chosen to be Moshe Rabbeinu, what are we saying? We're saying basically that the neshama or the soul of Moshe Rabbeinu had the qualities which are necessary to do the job that he was required to do. What were the qualities? Well, the main quality that Moshe Rabbeinu had to possess was to bring down the light of the Torah into physical form. That was the main quality. To bring down the Or Torah, that light, which is from the highest spiritual realm, you have to have a soul which can go up to that realm. So the soul of Moshe Rabbeinu was able to reach the highest part of the light, of spiritual light. Now the question is, why did he have this? Where did he get this quality from? Well, it has to do with something called roots of neshamas, and it has to do in many ways where we relate to Adam Rishon, the first man. Since all mankind are fragments of the soul of Adam, when we say we're fragments, we're not all equal fragments. You see, so that you have a concept called structure. The neshama has a structure to it, so that the neshama of Adam Rishon had a structure to it. The fact that you have a structure means that there are certain differentiating or distinct parts of the structure. So different neshamas that broke off in all different ways were distinct in the original place that they were on Adam Rishon. That kind of distinction or the position that they had with respect to the collective neshama of Adam Rishon in a certain way determines the kind of tikkun or the kind of job that they have to do to undo whatever damage was done by Adam and by themselves. But these are very, very deep matters, you see. Very deep matters. And like I say, there were people like Yari who were able to look at somebody and he could see quickly right into you where your neshama came from, what its root was, and exactly what it had to do. Now there's another part of that question which probably is unknowable. And that part is, why... Once we understand that a neshama related structurally to a certain aspect of Adam, we can understand why now it has a specific function. But why was it that part of the structure, you see? Or why is it that structure itself what determined that? These are very, very difficult questions, and I'm not 100% confident that these questions are even knowable, you see. When I mean knowable, I refer to the following. There's something which we use in the vernacular called north of the border or south of the border. Now I use this, it's a metaphor. North of the border refers to the world of God as He is by Himself. God as He is before creation or without creation or after creation, doesn't matter. But God as He is in Himself. South of the border is everything that God made, you see. Now the question is, does the information that we're looking at, is it something which goes so far back that it literally goes north of the border? In other words, in the sense that it goes into the realm of what's called the Ein Sof, or the realm of God's existence, then it's no longer knowable. But if in some way it remains in the realm of the created, it is knowable, even though it's super high, you see. So when you reach very, very high levels, and you get right by the border, it becomes very, very questionable. There are some questions which literally sit on the border, you see. One of the main questions which sits on the border is the fact is that the very notion of creation itself, that God, by the nature of the Manasham, there is nothing outside of God's existence. But yet, for you to be a separate and independent being, there must be some aspect of you which must be outside of God, in order for you to be distinct from God. But how is that possible? You see. In certain ways you must be part of God, in certain ways you must be outside of God. That's something which sits right on the border, and it's probably north of the border, you see. That's one type of question. Another kind of question is neshamas. Ultimately, why does this neshama have this kind of job, you see? And why was it placed in the structure in this way? Could be questions that only God knows Himself in His way, so they're not knowable, you see. The only thing that I say, in terms of my involvement in Hashkafa, is that I never concede anything north of the border. Unless it's got to be there. In other words, as far as I'm concerned, almost everything is knowable. Really. And you'd be shocked at how many things you thought were not knowable that suddenly became not only knowable, but fully understood. And I think in certain ways, even this year, I tried to demonstrate things that you always thought, I'll never know, or I'll have to know after I'm dead. 120 years, or I'm in the Shema, or maybe know Haba, and suddenly you realize that the answer is really here, you see. So the thing is, I think we have to give ourselves much more credit, and say that there's a lot more than we can know than meets the eye, you see. But there may be arrive certain points that are even unknowable. And even if it's unknowable, it doesn't mean every aspect is unknowable, you see. There could be many features of it that can be known. You see, and I personally am extremely reluctant, you see, to simply to advocate my responsibility in trying to understand everything that's possible to understand. So I would kricharan, or to go into different kinds of things, and you'd be surprised. It's many times possible to know this. So even this question that you're asking, why is it that Yosef became the Shorish of the Mashiach from Yosef? Why? I don't necessarily know that that's not knowable. I think that very possibly it is. It very possibly is. But to answer that is an enormous thing. Because to answer that, we've got to begin to understand what is a neshama. What is the structure of a neshama? What is the physiology and anatomy of a neshama itself, you see? That's number one. What is the interaction of the neshamas? And what does it mean that all neshamas collectively were on Adam Rishon? And how were they interrelated structurally? I think that until we even begin to deal with these questions, we can't consign something to the unknowable. You see. Well, whatever the story is. You see. I found it. In my, in a series which is beyond this, which is the advanced series, there are many questions that appear always unknowable, and suddenly, they're not only knowable, but suddenly the whole thing takes on a magnificent structure. You see. So, and the fact is that even in the advanced series which involve, even in the advanced series which involve, even in the advanced series that we're involved in, I see questions that are not answerable in the advanced level. They're not. They're just too difficult. But I know that there is another structure behind that, another magnificent landscape behind that, which suddenly all this becomes simple and knowable, and so on. And I can already feel the pulsations of that which is beyond the beyond already. But it's these are very, very difficult matters, you see, and so on. But the fact is that we cannot do that, and one of the things that I try and do in this year is to give you the confidence that you could know thousands of times more than you even think that you can know, if you learn how to ask the right questions, and if you think straight. That's the thing. If you will notice in all the hashkafas that I teach, there's always the pursuit of exact logic. Many times there's a precision here, you see, to show you that hashkafa is subjects itself to logic. It's not just some wild, and it's not necessarily emotional. It's not about who I feel this. We do not deal with the I feel notion. I feel is a different domain. It's a dimension of avoda, you see. But when it comes to understanding Torah, there's a domain is to understand. And it is our job to apply, you see, exact and precise logic to understand something as best as we can. And it's possible to do that. To formulate the principles and the rules and the mechanisms and the instrumentation. And I want you to know something, which is a very interesting thing, that if we can understand that the way the Baruch Hashem guides the world, you see, and everything that happens to us is explainable in terms of a specific hashgacha or providence. And hashgacha is an exact mechanism. And the fact of the matter is if we understood the mechanism, we could predict exactly what the world will look like 1 minute later. You see, it is. Because when a person does a certain deed, a certain action, if it's good or if it's bad, suddenly, by the laws of cause and effect, and by the strict rules of justice, certain things will ensue. And will always ensue, depending on what the input is. And you can really predict what that cause and effect relationship is. The only thing that's not predictable is free will. So that what happens is, we do not know what a person will do. But once he knows what he does, once we see what he does, then if we understood the hashgacha, we can know before what the Baruch Hashem is going to do in response. You see? Because that kind of information is knowable in exact, precise all the concepts of the different neshamas and so on, we will understand exactly the proportion of justice and mercy for that neshama or for this neshama, and so on and so forth. It is a finely tuned machine of incredible precision. The reason why we don't know any of this is because we don't know how the machine works. We don't know the parts of the machine. So the whole thing looks incredibly mysterious to us. But it is an incredible machine. The only thing which is not knowable in that machine is the actual what the person will do. But it's very similar to a computer, where the computer has a program, but the computer suddenly begins to work through some of its programs, and then it stops. And then suddenly on the screen it says, need input. And everything stops. And then what you do is you input certain information, certain quantities, and suddenly the machine goes off, the computer goes off again. For another 10 minutes, calculates and so on, and then it stops. Need more input. In other words, what it is, the machine at certain critical points needs your input, and it can't function without it. But once your input is in, you can sit back and relax, and the machine takes off. It's exactly the hashgacha. What the Baruch Hashem says at any moment in time is that all signals come from me. But once in a while I'm going to stop with a human being and I'm going to wait for your signals. And that's what the free will means. Free will means that the Baruch Hashem says, I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to wait for your signal. And your signal will tell me what to do. That's exactly what the Baruch Hashem and the hashgacha is like a computer, you see, which responds in a very precise way to the signals you send back. So that suddenly you do a certain deed, either good or bad. Suddenly the computer operates and suddenly the whole thing goes on and things begin to happen. For a certain while and then it stops. Stops. And suddenly the Shemayim, everyone is listening and watching you to find out what's the next move. And suddenly you do it, the machine starts again, there's a whole hashgacha, and so on. That's exactly what the relationship, it's a dual relationship between you and the Shemayim and God all the time. But the Baruch Hashem is functioning like a machine, so to speak, and waiting for your input. But that's the level of precision that's attainable. And when the Mashiach does arrive, a great deal of his light will be involved in making us understand what the hashgacha was, the machine called the hashgacha. But let's go back to what we were saying, yes.
That's really fascinating. But you were talking about it's understanding through logic, that would be like chachma rather than avoda. Is that because of the times and what you said before, which was, a few weeks back, which was that's the way we're going to know the Torah now through chachma? I mean, is that
yes,
related to all of this?
Related to some extent.
Even though we should daven and all the things that we do, but that the what's the word, like the key word or the catchword for the times would be more to understand through chachma, like we're doing.
It was always a catchword. while I'm on this thing, let me just say one thing which many people find very strange. It's very strange, especially when it relates to religion. God does not expect you to believe in Him. He doesn't. He expects you to understand Him. And the strange thing is the following. When you look in the Torah and you see the commandment, where the Baruch Hashem says, I want you to believe in who I am, right? It says, Ato, look in the Torah, it says, Ato horeso lo das ki Hashem Elokim eino mevadoi. What Ato, Moshe Rabbeinu was talking to the nation and saying, Ato horeso, you were all shown lo das, to know that God is God. He didn't ask you to believe that. The Baruch Hashem never said, believe in me. He never said that. The Baruch Hashem says, I will demonstrate my existence. Certainly there was Yetzias Mitzrayim and everything. You see. It's the same thing when it says in the Pasuk, V'yodata hayoim, and you should know today, V'hashevos levacha, and you should put in your heart, that it says there, Ki b'shamayim ma'alam ma'od v'tochas, Hashem Elokim, when it says there that the Baruch Hashem says, you should know in your mind and in your heart that I am God. But it says that you should know in your mind, what you see is that the mitzvah of believing in the Baruch Hashem is not a mitzvah of belief. The Baruch doesn't simply say, take it on faith. But the Baruch says, your awareness of me has to be through concrete understanding, yediyah. Now, if the Baruch is saying that, that means obviously there's an enormous amount of information which is accessible to us, which can be grasped by the intellect. See, this is very different than the concept, for example, in Christianity, where the whole thing rests on believing. You gotta believe. You see, to believe in something is believe in something that you hope something is true, or you believe it's true, but it's not something that you know is true. Torah is based on the concept of knowledge, of yediyah, and the word yediyah or knowledge is what's always used when it comes to the existence of God. You see, even though there is something called emunah, but emunah doesn't necessarily relate to that aspect. Emunah really relates to the belief that everything which happens, whether it's good or bad, is somehow leading to one objective. Emunah, in this case, really refers to the notion that you're staring at contradictions, good and bad, and that the Baruch is saying to you, I want you to believe, even though you don't understand, that all this is really for the good. And that even though everything looks like there's no rhyme or logic to it, but there is a logic to it, and there's a very precise operation. But Torah involves basically an incredible amount of understanding. It is unfortunate that in our generation we are not zeicha to the understanding to a large extent. That's why in so many ways in this year, you see, in many ways I'm on the heavy side of this year. People have said to me in this year, why don't you maybe sometimes concentrate on the Atzis HaMitzvahs, all the things and so on. The truth of the matter is because what is missing today, and probably the greatest thing which is wrong today in Klal Yisrael, is ignorance, is amaratus. People don't know anything. They don't understand what Judaism is. The fact of the matter is, with all the things you see out there, Judaism basically remains a foreign religion to most Jews. Because most Jews don't really understand what Judaism really is, or who God is, and what He wants, and how He deals with you, relates with you. Most people simply have very small information, or scattered information, incomplete information on these things about. That's why it's very critical to understand that, wait, there are answers for all these little questions you've had out there. These little things that have been bugging your mind and doubts for years and years, there are answers to these things. Not only that, but this information fits together in an incredibly systematic way. You see. So it's not just fragments and pieces here and there, you see. But actually it's a science. Judaism has the same power and the same beauty and the same structure and form as any science has. It does. And you shouldn't think that Chas v'Shalom, that your religion or Torah in any way is inferior to physics or anything else. If we don't see that structure, if we don't see the hand of the Baruch working in such a systematic way, it's because we are being punished. As I said, that the worse we are, the more transgressions we have. The way God punishes us the most is by the fact that He withdraws and does not allow us to see His unity. That's the way we're punished. You think you're punished because what? Because something bad happens to you, this and that and so on? You don't even know how you're being punished. The most severe punishment that the Buddhism gives us is that He doesn't allow us to understand who He is and how He manifests Himself in the world. So that we begin to think that what's going on here, everything seems to be a hefka, everything seems to be what? Chaotic. That's the punishment. The more we transgress, then the more the punishment makes us see chaos rather than unity and process. That's why the attempt of this year for the last 2 years, you see, whatever the situation, is to show you that Judaism is anything but chaotic. There's so much logic, there's so much precision and rigor in this thing that you'll be shocked at the matter. And that's the kind of message that I've really been going to give over, because that, more than anything else, will force you to believe that there is a God. You see, that there is one intelligence in this world, and that the world is contradictory, and as chaotic as it looks, is heading in one direction, you see, with one specific hand behind it. That is the most critical of all the information that you need to know. Once you have that information, then that fortifies your panemius or your interior. Then it's your job to go out with that fortification and apply it to the exterior by doing mitzvahs and by demonstrating in your life coming close to the B'nai Shalom. But first you've got to feel it from the inside. You will only feel it, not because you've been inspired, so to speak, but because you understand it. And this is the most important thing of all.
That's the way of God by Luzzatto.
That's Luzzatto.
Just one quick question. At the time that we call Olam Haba, the questions on Ein Sof will be no.
Everything south of the border will be no.
But north?
Truly north?
I would hear it, that's why.
True north you can't, because anything over the border, I'll tell you why. The question that's asked is, why can't we understand something which is in God's realm? Why can we not? And the answer is very simple. Because anything which is in the realm of God, which is called the world of the Ein Sof, is by definition not knowable. Why is God called Ein Sof? Ein Sof means without end. Now what does that mean? It means that God has no end. What does that talk about? Does that mean that God extends on and on infinitely, like space or something like that? No. Ein Sof doesn't refer to the dimensions of the B'nai Shalom, his length and the width and the height or anything like that. That's absurd. Ein Sof has nothing to do with the spatial aspect. Ein Sof has to do with the ability to know God or conceive Him. The B'nai Shalom is not subject to an idea or to a thought. There's no real way to understand the B'nai Shalom in concept, in a real sense. Who He is really is not knowable in concept, because who He is cannot be bounded or restricted to an idea, you see. That's the problem, and because of that, God is beyond ideas, He's beyond the ability to conceive. When God created us, He also created what? The way we know. You see, the way we understand things is part of who we are. Then we cannot use part of who we are to understand that which is outside of us. So therefore God is not knowable in new terms of human thinking. Like it says in the prophet, my thoughts are not your thoughts, and my ways are not your ways. I'm outside of you, I'm not in your system. Because I'm not in your system, you cannot know who I am, in any sense. So therefore, you can't ask me, why did I do what I really did? I will reveal to you what you are capable of knowing. So in your world, you see basically certain things. You see that the reason why God created reality because He loves the people in the Shamas, and that God is a mative. God really wanted to bestow goodness. But that's what we see from this world down, south of the border. Once we're in the world and we look around and we see that the world is capable of giving great goodness, we see that the B'nai Shalom is directing the world ultimately to a great goodness. So we say that the reason why God created the world was to give great goodness. But if we say to ourselves, but why did you create the world in yourself? That's not knowable, you see. That's the reason that we understand as we examine our existence. But we cannot examine God's thought as He Himself, because it's beyond the reasoning. He doesn't think like we do, He doesn't will like we do. So there's no way that we can grasp what He is or how He does what He does. That's north of the border. And that, of course, is impossible. And there are things which are north of the border. But there are many things south of the border. For example, when Moshe Rabbeinu looked up and he saw that Rabbi Akiva was supposed to be killed, Moshe Rabbeinu said to the B'nai Shalom, Zu Torah v'Zchor? How is it possible that this man, Rabbi Akiva, who was so great, is killed in such a horrible fashion, where his skin is ripped off by the Romans? So the B'nai Shalom said to him, Gzelim lefonai, it is a decree from before me. It's my decree. Now the question that you have to ask right away, what does that mean, it's my decree? Is it north of the border or the south of the border?
North.
Wait. Is it north or south? When the Baruch Hashem said to Moshe, it's it's my decree. So he said to Moshe, I'm sorry, I can't tell you. But that doesn't answer the question. Does that mean that Moshe will never know the answer? Or at that point in time? What does that mean? I believe, and I have no doubt, that it is south of the border. It is clearly knowable. Because Gzeir Yofai is referring to the Hanokas HaYichud. What Moshe Rabbeinu was asking is, why do these tzaddikim suffer? But I just told you in a certain sense why they do. Yisuin Shel Ahava. And I've given you a whole shir to some extent why Rabbi Akiva died to allow the Jews to survive in the Golus for the next 2,000 years. You see. So there is information that's known. But what Moshe wanted to know is much more detailed information. Why is this in this specific way? And the Baruch says, that kind of information is not knowable. It's knowable, but it's not knowable to you now. Exactly why this person would suffer in that way at that time involves such information that's beyond your ability to know, even with all your prophecy. Because you can only know in general these aspects, but you cannot know the specifics of these things. But does that mean it's not knowable? No, it is knowable. But yet, before the Messianic period, and before Olam Haba, you do not have the equipment to know this information. But it's still south of the border. Because Olam Haba is south of the border. You will spend your entire existence in Olam Haba, which will be endless. What are you going to do in Olam Haba? Basically, you will be involved in grasping greater and greater levels of this unity. In many forms. And this grasping, this understanding will give you enormous levels of simcha. And it's going to go on eternally. But still, it's south of the border. Because it's still subject to method, to process, to some form of mechanism. That's the whole difference between God north of the border and us south. South of the border means that in order to go from here to there, in whatever you do, it involves some kind of a procedure or some kind of process which is bounded and which can be defined. Whether that takes place in Olam Hazeh or Olam Haba. It means that you're involved in some activity which can be clearly understood in terms of a procedure, a process, a conceptual movement or a structure. But north of the border means that there is no structure anymore, because nothing is defined, because everything is beyond definition and beyond structure. It's that he has no structure. That would mean he would be chaotic or amorphous. What it means is that in the world of God there is no such thing as structure. Because structure is an inferior element to God. We think that if something is highly structured and highly understood, that on the contrary is a superior element. But the fact is that with respect to chaos, structure is superior. But with respect to God, structure is inferior. Because structure is limiting. It's saying this and not that. It's limiting individual things to their own things so that it detracts from absolute unity. So structure puts everything in its place, which of course is an advantage when everything's out of its place. But the concept that something has to be in its place is a limit. And as against God, that is an inferior aspect. Because God has no place. He is all over in a sense. You see. So therefore God is beyond the limitations and the disadvantage of structure. That's the essence. If something is knowable, it means that you can reason it and understand it through logical processes or through whatever kinds of processes. Whether it's Olam Hazeh or Olam Haba. But it's still subject to process. It's still subject to go from premise to conclusion in some way, on some level of existence. But in the Baruch Hashem there is no premise and there's no conclusion. You see, because he is his thinking in an absolute unity. And there's no movement from here to there. It's all total, it's all perfect, and it's all there, all at the same time. We cannot understand that. That's impossible for us to know. But the fact of the matter is that there's an enormous amount of information that we can know, you see. Yes.
I'm sorry, but getting back to knowing the Ein Sof, by the very fact that we're talking about it, I can't understand.
Yeah.
We're asking questions. We still have questions about Ein Sof. Obviously, it's not. We recognize that there is a part that's unknowable to us. So there's still some connection that we have. We're aware of it. We ask questions about it. It's not close to us.
But it's always from the negative. What we're aware of is really what we don't know. The best that we can come to understand God is what we don't know. That's how we define God. the way to understand God as He is by Himself is by always saying He is not this, He is not that, He is not this. What we're doing is, to understand God is really to distance ourselves further and further from Him, and to understand how He is not what He made.
Okay.
And that's how we really understand who He is. We cannot go beyond the border and understand how He is as He is, you see. But we can understand what He's not. We are like this, and He's not that way. We need this, but He's not that way. That's how we understand more and more who He is. He's always understood from the negative, never from the positive.
But I see that the border is not a straight line. It's a very jagged line.
Sure, it's a jagged line, yeah. It's a jagged line. Continue here. Let's continue with the concept of Mashiach, as we were saying, and this is the notion that the Mashiach basically suffers because he is blocked from his light. And his light, of course, is enormous. And the light that he possesses is the true essence of the Torah. Now, when the Mashiach is blocked by his light, it's because there's an internal damage inside his personality, as I said. He doesn't suffer physically, he suffers mentally. And what is, there's a damage to his personality in a real way, such that it prevents him from grasping, in essence, or coming close to that kind of light. Now, the Ramchal says, for some interesting reason, that the various stages of the Mashiach, in terms of how he accesses his information, is represented by certain letters. The Mashiach in his lowest state, in the state when he sees a certain aspect of life, and he knows that he's different, but he's enormously still separated from that light, is represented by the letter Samach. Now the beginning of the redemption, really, the true beginning of the redemption, is not when the Jews go back to Israel, when they build the Beis HaMikdash. These are early steps that occur far down the line. The real thing that starts is the fact that the Mashiach suddenly begins to grow. And suddenly, the blocks or the barriers which were placed on them begin to disappear. That is the beginning of the redemption. But the fact is that nobody knows that except the Mashiach himself. So that the first true activity of the redemption is a private one. It is not public. It is private. But the day that the Mashiach suddenly begins to experience the removal of that block, and what? And suddenly the accessibility to his light is the day that the Gula really starts in earnest. Now it's also important to realize is that the Mashiach, because of the fact that he's missing this light, and because of the fact that as the barrier is removed, he begins to have that light available, doesn't suddenly jump up and become a Mashiach. You see, the Mashiach doesn't go from a state of Kilkul to a state of Tikkun in one fell swoop. It doesn't work that way. It's a slow step process. There's a certain steps to the process, and there are many reasons for that. The main reason for that is that the Gula which will appear, the redemption which will occur to us in nowadays, is a redemption which essentially will occur by virtue of Teva, or natural law, so that things will happen much slower. If the thing would occur through nisim, through miracles, it would be much quicker. But it won't be that way. And because of that, the Mashiach, therefore, will begin to access his light slowly. Now this tells us a very, very deep thing. And something which is very, very important, and comes out obviously from what I've said, but it's very hard to believe. You see, because nobody will think in these terms. But if the Mashiach suffers because he's blocked from his light, and if the access to that light is a slow, progressive elevation, you see, because of the fact that it's going to follow in a Tevadic way, basically what we see is that the block itself has to do with natural law. In other words, the barrier which holds the Mashiach from his life is not some supernatural barrier that comes down and holds him from his light. But in some way, it's some internal personality or psychological aspect that blocks him from his light. It is a Teva thing. Because the whole thing happens through Teva. Which means that the Mashiach himself and the way that he accesses his light is also Teva. You see. It's a very, very important thing I've said because it's very unusual. We think that there's some kind of supernatural, magical thing, like some kind of a demon holding him back, or some kind of really thing that's holding him in chains and so on, and he can't sing. And that the way he's going to break open the towel is by suddenly going to break him the chains, right? And suddenly he's going to begin to understand, and like some kind of miraculous thing's going to happen, like Moshe Rabbeinu goes up in Har Sinai, and the Torah is given to him in 40 days. That's not the way it's going to happen. Because of the fact that the last Gula is essentially built on the concept of Kilkul, and the fact that it's built on the notion that the Jews will not be worthy of what happens, and therefore the Mashiach is in a state of Kilkul to help them out, to keep them around. That's why the Baruch Shem does the whole thing in Teva, by natural law. Now why does God do it by Teva, or natural law? Why? That natural law, through normal means, not through miracles. Why? Why is the last redemption through normal or natural ways, and not through some miracles and so on? You see. Why do you think that is? Let's see. Who could actually answer that? Put that on pause. Put on pause. I'll do my own. Yeah. That's one answer. The main thing.
To
Yes.
decoy.
Yes.
To
Okay. Right. I'm surprised that you got it. You got it. Go ahead. Put that on.
Sometimes I say something.
Okay. What was said is correct. Is it the tape now? The main reason why the last redemption will occur according to natural means is to fool or disguise it from the accusing angel. Why is that? Because basically, for God to perform a miracle for the Jews requires that the Jews be in a high state of spirituality. You see, a high state of spirituality. And this is a very, very fundamental principle. If the Baruch Shem suddenly brought the final redemption through a miracle, you know what happened? The Jews will be instantly destroyed. And this brings us to a very, very critical concept in spirituality, in Ruchnius. If you understand this, you will be very, very far ahead of the game. It's one of the most critical aspects of spirituality. It's called timing. And let me explain you what I mean. Very important to understand this. Let's say, for example, the God wants to give Jews certain things. He wants to give them a certain amount of brachas, a certain amount of spirituality. He will give it to them. But basically, it depends if the Jews are worthy of it or not. If the Jews are not worthy of it, then what happens? The accusing angel suddenly runs up and says, they don't deserve this. They don't deserve it. And it doesn't belong to them. And he says, because they don't belong to them, it belongs to me, and I want to destroy the Jews. So therefore, if the Baruch Shem therefore wants to give them spirituality, while there's an accusing thing here, that's dangerous. Because then he alerts the accuser to what's happening. You see. That's why the Baruch Shem has to keep the Jews in a state of inferiority, so that the accusing angel is not alerted. This is an incredibly important concept. In every generation, in every time, and in every specific person, there's only a certain amount of spirituality that he can handle. Do you remember we once went into this in terms of trade relationships? I don't know if you remember this. We had a whole share on this. But the point is that at every point in time, there's a certain amount of accusation hurled against the Jews. That accusation determines to what degree the spirituality of the Jews is revealed or concealed. The Baruch Shem cannot reveal something which will incite or provoke the accusing angel from suddenly accusing. To do that, it's attempt annihilation. Because as soon as the accusing angel becomes aware of the status of Klal Yisrael by the sudden gift that they're giving, then suddenly says they don't deserve anything, they should be annihilated. You see, it alerts, it's like a red flag. Any bracha, anything good which is given to the Jews that's beyond their merit, instantly incites or instantly awakens the Makatrig to begin to accuse them. And Klal Yisrael cannot survive that kind of accusation. Hence, if the Baruch Shem wants to give them something, it has to be done very, very hidden way. You see. Now, how does the Baruch Shem hide things? Several ways. But one of the main ways that he hides things is through solace, through problems, through darkness. So that's one reason why the bracha, or the redemption, occurs in darkness, in suffering. So that the accusing angel doesn't see it. Because he cannot see how darkness and suffering brings brachas. Do you see why it's done that way? That's why darkness and suffering, the choshech, is the Yeshua. And that's why it works. Because if it wasn't darkness, then it would be obvious and revealed to the Satan. And hence it could not transpire. So therefore the redemption must take place in darkness, not in light. There's another way that the Baruch brings Gula with the Satan Kaviyachal on his back. And that's not only by concealing it in darkness, but by concealing it in natural law, or in Teva. Because there's something about cause and effect, straight natural law, which seems to be very, very what? Like, what?
Boring.
Not boring, but somewhat, where is God in all this? Or like, nothing spectacular here. So therefore, what the Baruch does is bring it in natural law. And that's what it says in the Gemara. The Talmud says the very thing. The Talmud says that the ultimate redemption will be just like the dawn. And if you notice the dawn, it's darkest before the dawn, and then suddenly what happens is, suddenly the rays of light begin to appear on the horizon. Very slowly. Kimo, slowly, begins to get light. For a long time you notice this. Slowly. Until suddenly the disk of the sun suddenly bursts up, and suddenly it's all light. Why? Why does it go so slowly? Why does it creep? And that's why I call the ultimate redemption what's called the creeping Geula. Why does it creep? Why does it creep? Why does it creep? The creeping Geula, it creeps. It creeps for one reason. Because there is a Makatlik, an accusing angel sitting here all the time. So it has to creep. It has to be so little. And each step has to occur so almost uneventfully that nobody even knows that anything's happening. You see? And this is the point. This is the thing. The reason why the tortoise won the race with the hare is because the tortoise won the race creeping. So the hare could never believe that the thing could make it, you see. And that's the thing. Klal approaches the Geula in such a ho-hum fashion, in such a devious, disguised fashion, that Makatlik doesn't understand what's going on. So they not only approach it through suffering and through darkness, but through natural law. And that's why it goes ever so slowly and ever so uneventfully. And ever so unremarkably. You see. That's why the whole thing is Teva. So if therefore we see the fundamental concept that the ultimate redemption is based on natural law, it means even Mashiach himself and all the things he's going through isn't some way fixed on natural law. That means that his fundamental problem is essentially a natural one. It doesn't mean it can be dealt with naturally, but it's a natural thing. It has to do with aspects of his interior personality and mind. That's what's blocking him. And the ultimate redemption, or the ultimate way that he will release that, is also through some aspect of natural law. And that's why it will be done slowly. So that first we have the level of the samach, and then we go on to the next level, which Ramchal calls the sin. It's represented by the letters. And we can mention a very unusual one, and we can mention aspects of it in song. But let me just go into this first. As he said, the first level of Mashiach is represented by the samach. The next one is represented by the sin. When the Mashiach is totally down and out, he's represented by the letter samach. When the Mashiach begins to revive and begins to move into the sphere of accessibility of his life, it's represented by the letter sin. That's why there's a pasuk in Tehillim, Yeshaya, starts off, Hine Yaskil Abdi. Behold, my servant shall become wise. That's what it says. V'yorim v'nosah v'gov, and he will be elevated and lifted and made exceedingly high. That's the first pasuk. That indicates the beginning of the elevation of the Mashiach. Behold, Hine Yaskil Abdi, my servant, meaning the Mashiach, will begin to suddenly become wise. Haskalah. Now Yaskil starts with the sin. That represents the beginning of the messianic movement itself, when he goes out of the bore or the pit which he's in, and he begins to go out and begins to go towards the light. That sin is therefore in the word Yaskil. Finally, it begins to progress, and the pasuk says progress. How does he progress? V'yorim, and he's going to elevate himself. V'nosah, and he's going to become even higher. V'govim yod, and he will become exceedingly high. And the Medrash says, what does that mean? The Mashiach is going to grow. He's going to grow from a point when he just basically sees that light, but he has really no access, and then he's going to begin to grow. And as he grows, he's going to, first of all, in the first couple of levels, he's going to become greater than Avram. Then he's going to go higher and become greater than Moshe Rabbeinu. And then finally, when he reaches the crescendo of that light itself, which is the hidden light, the Or Mashiach, the Or HaGadol, the hidden light, he's represented by the Shin, the letter Shin, and that makes him higher than the Malachim itself, the Malach HaShoretz, the Gova Miyod. And what the Talmud says is, Mi Malach HaShoretz. He's higher than Avram, first step. He's higher than Moshe Rabbeinu, second step. He's higher than the Malachim, third step. So there's that incredible elevation, you see, as he begins to move out. But that is represented as he goes from the sin, from the samach to the sin level. And these are the various levels of the Mashiach himself as he relates to his life.
He's going to get to his level, because it seems to me that there's, I mean, it's, have this really gut level, very intuitive feeling that he's talking like going
Doesn't my son
on.
do that to all of us?
What's that?
What he's doing to Mashiach?
Yes, it would serve her. But I'm going to get to Klal Yisrael in a minute. Now we're talking about the person that actually in Mashiach. But I'd like to say one thing. Put this on. I want to say one more thing before we actually begin to. We have to actually begin to deal with. I'd like to say one thing which is very important, and it's this concept of the Yeshua and Mashiach. I have basically only discussed a certain part of the Yeshua and Mashiach, and I want to explain to you what part I've discussed. The Yeshua and Mashiach is revealed in the Parsha by Yosef, where it says there in Parsha Vayeshev, when it says that the brothers threw Yosef into the bore. They threw him into a pit. You remember when before they sold him, they took him and they threw him into a pit. That's what it says. Okay? They threw him into a pit, and he was sitting in the pit until they brought him out of the pit and they sold him to the Ishmaelites to sell down to Egypt. So that when the prophet says, it says, Habor, it says they put a pit, it says, what kind of pit was it? It says Habor, Ain, Bo, it says Habor, Rake. Okay? Ain, Bo, Mayim. That's what it says. Now what does this mean? It says the following. It says, what kind of pit did they throw him in, Yosef? Habor Rake. The pit was empty, and Ein Bo Mayim, there was no water in it. That's what it says. The bore was empty, and there was no water in it. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. If you tell me that the bore is empty, isn't it obvious that there's no water? So that's what the Gemara says. Yes, the bore was empty. It was empty. There was no water in it, but there was something else in it. What was in the bore? Nechoshim v'akrabim. There were serpents and scorpions in it. So what the Torah is telling us is that Yosef was thrown into a bore, and the bore was empty. The bore was empty of water, but in the bore were snakes and scorpions. So Yosef should have been killed at any moment. That's what the Gemara says. This concept of Yosef in the bore is the concept of Mashiach in his Torah, in his state of inaccessibility, in his pilgrim, in his what's called in his kippah. How? Because there's two aspects of the bore. One aspect is that the Mashiach is in a bore. He is in a bore. What do you mean he's a bore? He's underground and he has no access to go up there. By being in a pit, he's out of the mainstream of life. He is what? He's completely withdrawn, or he's imprisoned in a place where he cannot what? Participate or partake of anything in life. That notion that the Mashiach is in a bore represents the notion that the Mashiach is blocked from his life. He's in a bore. So we've discussed that now. We've discussed the notion that the Mashiach is what? Is deprived. The bore symbolizes the state of deprivation. And the Mashiach is deprived of his life. And that's the source of his agony. But wait, that wasn't the only problem that Yosef had. Because Yosef in the bore represents the Mashiach from Yosef in his problem, you see. Not only was Yosef in an empty bore, and therefore in a state of deprivation with no food or water, nothing, but something else was living there with him. Serpents and scorpions which can kill him at any moment. That shows us the Mashiach had another type of suffering. Not only does he suffer deprivation, or what's called omission, but the Mashiach daily must face certain types of seductions and certain types of temptations which can destroy him at any moment. So there are two aspects to his suffering. He is blocked or separated from his spirituality. But in addition, he is constantly involved and he's one step away of falling into the abyss of Tumah. You see? So it's not only a question of what he's missing, but there's also a question of a certain temptation in another direction to destroy him. And he is constantly at the edge, wavering all the time, you see. And it's all he can do to keep himself above water. And this is the point. And it says, the Ramchal says very interesting enough, that it is only the light of the Bonisham, it's only the what? The chesed and the mercy of the Bonisham that keeps him alive, really. That's how powerful the Yeshua is. It's like the Satan puts his tentacles and at every moment wants to grab, not only does he block the light of the Mashiach, because the light of the Mashiach is in the bosom of the Satan, but he not only holds back the light of the Mashiach, but he wants to grab the Mashiach around his neck and tear him away into his own domain and swallow him up whole. You see. So the Mashiach is forever trying to keep out of the dragon's mouth. And this is an incredible, difficult situation. We will not go into the meaning of what that dragon's mouth is. You see. Again, that would involve just advanced level information and so on, of what that is. But suffice to say that there are two aspects to his suffering. There's the aspect of the bore, the deprivation, and there's the aspect of the seduction and the destruction, which constantly attempts to overwhelm the Mashiach, to totally destroy him. The redemption of the Mashiach, the personal redemption of the Mashiach, and the Mashiach needs the Yeshua. He needs Yeshua more than anyone else. That's the fact. And therefore the redemption of the Mashiach is an aspect of being what? Slowly taken away from the dragon's mouth and beginning to go towards the light. And this is the essence of Yosef, of what it is. But again, we're dealing with the notion that it's all b'derech hateva, it's essentially through natural law, and this is an important thing to realize. And these are the ways that it's happening at this point in time. Now there's one more idea that I would like to say before we conclude today, and that's the following. We're talking about a Mashiach who's in a steady state of suffering. Mashiach b'kilkuloi, you see. But the truth of the matter is, there's somebody else who's suffering with the Mashiach, who doesn't even know they're suffering. And the fact of the matter is that that being who is suffering, you see, is waiting for the Mashiach to cure him. Because as soon as the Mashiach gets cured, you see, and that's what it's called, the suffering of the Mashiach is called a kilkul, or a sickness, a holy, and therefore the cure is called, it's a refuah. When we talk about the Mashiach, we're talking about a refuah shlema. You see, the essence of refuah really applies to Mashiach, because we're saying the person who's not only troubled, but troubled by some kind of internal what? Internal devastation. So the Mashiach needs a refuah shlema, in the highest sense of the word. And more than that his refuah shlema, his refuah, or his sickness, is the reflection of the sickness of Klal Yisrael at its inner core. Remember, the way the Mashiach suffers is exactly the inner core of the disease of Klal Yisrael. So that the refuah that has to come to Mashiach is the refuah that has to come to the Jews in the redemption. The refuah of the Mashiach is the refuah of Klal Yisrael. So when it says Roifei Cholei Amo Yisrael, that bracha doesn't really refer to physical sickness, although you can say that in the Shemona Esrei, when you say that God cures the sick. But in essence, the bracha of Roifei Cholei Amo Yisrael, that God heals the sick of Israel, really refers to what? To the aspect of the spiritual sickness of Klal Yisrael and of the Mashiach. But there's one other being who is waiting desperately to be cured by the Mashiach. He's been waiting a long, long time. Next time, we will speak about who that being is.